I have been involved in the life of the church since birth. And now trying to wrap my head around it, my involvement in life in the church, I've been a pastor longer than I was a church member. I've been a pastor for 27 years now. And I have to tell you, the most difficult times in my ministry, looking back over it, has been those times when there's been conflict in the church. Unfortunately, I've experienced it, I've lived through it, and did my best to believe that somehow God was going to bring hope out of the fallout. So today, we're tackling what I think is a very serious issue. What happens when good people fight each other? And we're going to start in an interesting place with the movie Captain America: Civil War. We brought in a little DC universe, and I apologize for trying to intermix DC and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. What were you thinking, Dan? How many of you have seen Endgame yet? How many of you haven't seen Endgame? Okay, here's the spoiler. I can finally tell you, everybody dies. Oh wait, that was Infinity War. That was the last one. I'm always a movie behind. Well, the basis of Captain America's Civil War is that there is a disagreement causing conflict and fighting among a once close band of superheroes. So if you haven't seen any of the Avengers movies, if you haven't seen Captain America's Civil War, here's what happens. Spoiler alert. There's a group of superheroes that come together. They form an alliance known as the Avengers. And it might be a stretch, but I think they're like the church. Some are better than others, or at least they think so. They didn't agree on everything. Each of them had their own opinions, and they seemed to be on the side of fighting for what was right and what's good in the world, and together they fought and defeated many enemies. So when the movie opens, we see Captain America leading the Avengers in their continued efforts to safeguard humanity, but an incident occurs which causes collateral damage. People die. And then there's political pressure that perhaps the Avengers should be governed by a group outside of themselves, and this new status quo fractures this once close team. And it results in two camps. One camp is led by Captain America and his desire for the Avengers to remain free while defending humanity without government interference, and the other camp following Iron Man, who surprisingly supports government oversight and accountability, and the end result is the good guys have a civil war. Some epic battles. If you like fight scenes, this is probably the movie for the most epic battles. Well, I don't know. Endgame. Maybe. No spoilers on that, though. But here's the truth about conflict in the church. Rarely does God get any glory. Nor does it paint the church in a good light. When there's conflict, unhealthy conflict in the church, we repeat negative Christian history, and good people get wounded. I mean, churches often have their spats. There's the debates over the big three, the 3 Ps, property, parsonages, and pastors. Then there's the debates over sexuality and euthanasia and church and state, and the list goes on and on. But I think there's a difference between healthy conflict and all-out civil war. Church fights aren't always bad. It just depends on what you're fighting for. I mean, I've heard of churches that have had knockdown, drag-out fights, people leaving over the color of carpeting. I know of one church that fought over pew cushions. The one person who was against the color that was chosen on the Sunday that the pew cushions were installed and used for the very first time, she brought a lawn chair and sat in it the entire service. She refused to sit on the tacky-colored pew cushions. Hey, we're not immune here either. We've had our own share of conflicts over furniture placement and flag placement and books studied. Then there was the big one. I'm looking around. None of you remember the big one. It happened in the late 1860s. Well, Don, you might have been there. I don't know. It's over the issue of slavery. If you're not familiar with it, our original building is across the street, Wesley Chapel, and when the country was fighting over the issue of slavery, the Methodist Episcopal Church at the time was fighting over the issue of slavery, and within Wesley Chapel Methodist Episcopal Church, you had pro-slavery people and you had anti-slavery people. And one Sunday morning, the pro-slavery people showed up, and they were greeted in a very healthy way. The anti-slavery people were holding shotguns and said, if you are going to be pro-slavery, you cannot worship here. Spoiler alert, that would be unhealthy church conflict. So unhealthy that those who were pro-slavery showed the anti-slavery people and started a church right across the street. It's our building out front. Ironically enough, they named it Freedom Church. They were pro-slavery, but named their church Freedom. Get it? Okay. That's just because this is the Freedom District of Carroll County. But it was such a heated debate, it wasn't solved until 1947, some 80 years later, when the young adults and the youth of the church convinced the parents to come back together. So whenever I hear about healthy and unhealthy conflict within the church, I'm reminded of the words of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement. He had a good rule of thumb. He used to say, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. And so we heard a good reading from Gary from Acts 15 about a church fight in the early church. This is a defining moment for the early church. It's referred to as the Jerusalem Council, and it's some 20 years after the resurrection. And the church found itself wrestling with the questions of participation and salvation. Specifically, what is required for salvation and thus involvement in the church? And there was a certain group of individuals. Luke, the author of Acts, doesn't call them out by name. He just simply calls them a certain group. We still have them in the church. We refer to them as they. Pastor, they are talking. We don't know who they are, and Paul's saying that. In other words, there is a group who doesn't really represent the whole church, but they're the loudest, and they're not speaking for everyone. They're speaking for themselves, but they're getting the most attention. And this particular group were Pharisees. But they were also followers of Christ. Now, it seems that the Pharisees had heard that Gentiles, non-Jewish people who lived in Antioch, were being baptized and welcomed into the fellowship of the church without being circumcised. You see, they believed you couldn't be saved unless you were circumcised. In other words, you had to become Jewish before you could become Christian. In other words, you had to accept the law before Christ would accept you. So if what that group is saying is true, then the grace of God in Jesus Christ isn't enough for salvation. You have to add to it. You have to add to it the law of Moses. Now, Peter, on the other hand, summarizes the theology that he was promoting in the early church in verse 11 when he says, "We believe that we are saved by the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ." The Pharisees were so bound by their customs, they were confusing non-essentials with essentials, and they were making life more difficult. Not only for the Gentile Christians, they were making it more difficult for the work of the Holy Spirit. And what happens next is interesting. I think it provides kind of a good model for conflict resolution. You see, the church in Antioch doesn't go rogue. They don't wash their hands of the Jerusalem church. They don't say, forget Jerusalem, we're going to just do our own thing. No, they send a delegation to Jerusalem. They send key leaders, Paul and Barnabas and other people who are welcomed by the apostles. Here's how Paul described the event. In Acts 15, we heard how Peter or Luke described the events. Here's how Paul describes the events in Galatians 2, verses 7 through 10. You can follow along if you'd like. Paul writes, "On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do." So Peter stands up in Acts 15 to respond, but he doesn't just respond to the presenting issue. He recognizes that Christ's work is so expansive in its scope that they weren't just rebuilding a house, but they were resetting the foundation. They were creating something new. We have to remember, up until this point, the followers of Christ were just one additional segment of Judaism. There were all of these different segments of Judaism depending upon who your rabbi was. So they were just referred to those Jews who followed the rabbi Jesus. But here, Peter is setting up an entirely new movement. And he frames this new movement, the establishment of this new movement, in three important ways. First, he sets a new foundation. While the Pharisees insisted that they should proceed into the future based on what God revealed in the past, Peter opens up their decision-making to include what God is revealing now. Peter recognized that God was doing something new and unexpected, and that they needed to allow for the actual current work of the Holy Spirit to be considered. They needed to listen to the stories that Peter was telling, and the stories that Paul was telling, and the stories that Barnabas was telling about their work among the Gentiles, and let that evidence be admissible for discerning this new foundation, this new direction, this new movement. In other words, Peter is saying that yes, God did speak in the past, and we should listen to that. But God is also speaking now, and we should pay close attention. I think this is a good word for the modern church. God did speak in the past, and we should listen to that. But God is speaking now, and we should pay close attention. Second, he builds on the foundation. You see, Peter moves from what they must do to be saved to what they've done to be saved. And he gives the answer. What did they do to be saved? They believed. When they do look around, the evidence is ever before them that not only were the Gentiles coming to Christ by faith alone, Christ himself was accepting them and filling them with the Holy Spirit. And all of that was done without circumcision. All of that was done without the Mosaic law. All this means is that the Pharisees are a little late to the party. It's a little late to be speaking of the entrance requirements for salvation, because Peter is telling the Pharisees, if you open your eyes, you're going to see that the deal's already done. They've already been approved by God through faith alone, so they don't need your approval. Third, Peter actually then dismantles the old foundation. While the Pharisees are asking for these Gentile Christians to go through the same approval process that Jews had to go through, Peter reminds them that there's a new approval process, one that eliminates works and relies on grace. And then James, given all this, follows up to Peter by suggesting that they not make things more complicated or difficult than they need to be, that there should be no other entrance requirement other than salvation by faith through grace. So what can we learn from this story? I've always believed wherever two or three are gathered, there will be a difference of opinion. But what I've learned from this story is that the church in Jerusalem made sure that the essence, the core conviction of the gospel was never compromised. Throughout this debate, God's love as revealed through Jesus Christ was never conceded. It was never compromised. Second, they preserved the unity of the body of Christ. No one walked. And that's countercultural. Everyone wants to get his or her own way, and if they don't get it, often they walk away. I see it so often in the church: do it my way or I'm walking. And often it's not people actually telling you that, they just slowly slip away. But the beauty of this passage is that people who disagreed with one another very sharply preserve the integrity and the unity of the body of Christ. We read finally in Acts 15:30-31, so they were sent off, Paul and Barnabas, and went down to Antioch. When they gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter that was written by the Jerusalem council. When its members read it, they rejoiced at the exhortation. We can be proud to be part of this wonderful tradition. For this is how people act when communities are messy. When good people see things in different ways, the gospel is integral and unity is preserved. Thanks be to God.